December 16, 1944, 5:30 in the morning. 2,000 German artillery guns open fire at the same moment along an 85-mile front. The ground shakes. Trees explode into splinters. American soldiers in their foxholes press their faces into frozen mud and pray that the next shell lands somewhere else. The barrage lasts 90 minutes. When it stops, something emerges from the fog. Steel. 68 tons of it, moving slowly, deliberately like a predator that knows nothing can stop it. A King Tiger. The most heavily armored tank ever built. 150 millimeters of steel on its front face. An 88 millimeter gun that can reach out and kill you before you even see the muzzle flash. And the German commander inside that machine knows something that makes him feel invincible. He knows exactly what the Americans are carrying. He has read the intelligence reports. He knows their guns. He knows their ranges. He knows their limits. He is completely catastrophically wrong. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Join us as we explore more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. This community grows stronger with every one of you. What you are about to hear is the story of a weapon that killed Panthers at 2,000 yards before the Germans even knew it existed. A weapon born from an anti-aircraft gun pointed at the wrong sky. A weapon that sat in motor pools while American crews died in burning Shermans, delayed by one man's doctrine, freed only by his death. By the time the Germans figured out what was hunting them, more than 300 of their tanks were already burning in Belgian fields. This is the story of the M36 Jackson, and it begins not in a tank factory, not in a Pentagon office, but in the Norman hedgerows where American boys were learning the most brutal arithmetic of the war. August 1944. The blood on the bocage grass has not yet dried. For 2 months since the beaches of Normandy, American tank crews have been dying in a pattern so consistent it has become almost routine. A Sherman moves forward. A Panther appears. The Sherman fires. The shell bounces. The Panther fires once. The Sherman burns. 5 men inside. Maybe 3 crawl out. Maybe 2 survive long enough to reach a field hospital. The 75 millimeter gun on the standard Sherman cannot penetrate the front armor of a Panther at any practical combat range. The newer 76 millimeter mounted on upgraded Shermans and the M10 tank destroyer is marginally better. Against a Tiger, both weapons are essentially useless from the front or the side. The American crews know this. They have known it since Omaha Beach. They learn it again every day, in every hedgerow, in every sunken lane across Normandy. On August 7th, east of the village of Mortain, a Sherman from the 743rd Tank Battalion sits behind a row of apple trees. 300 yards away, through gaps in the hedge, 5 Panthers move in column. The gunner finds the lead tank in his sight. 900 yards. He fires. The shell strikes the Panther's frontal plate and skips away like a stone thrown across a pond. Pale orange spark. The Panther keeps moving. The Sherman commander screams one word into the intercom. Back. Too late. The Panther fires from 1,200 yards. The shell punches through 3.5 inches of American armor as if it were paper. The Sherman burns. That single moment, repeated dozens of times that day across the Mortain front, tells the whole story of American armor in the summer of 1944. The Germans were not winning because they were braver or more numerous. They were winning because their guns could reach across distances where American guns were helpless. A single Panther in a good defensive position could destroy 4 or 5 Shermans before artillery or a lucky flank shot finally killed it. The reports from the front reached 1st Army headquarters in language that repeated itself with numbing consistency. Ammunition ineffective at observed range. Vehicle lost to single-round frontal aspect. Crew morale deteriorating. There was a solution. It existed. It had existed for almost 2 years. It was sitting in a warehouse in Michigan, and the man who could have authorized its deployment had blocked it repeatedly, methodically, with the absolute certainty of someone who has never been wrong before. His name was Leslie James McNair, Lieutenant General, Commander of Army Ground Forces, the man who decided from his quiet carpeted office in the Pentagon how the United States Army would fight tanks. McNair was brilliant. Everyone who worked with him agreed on that. 61 years old, small, almost professorial, wearing thick glasses over eyes that had been damaged by an artillery fragment in the First War. He had built the Army Ground Forces from almost nothing into the largest ground combat organization in American history. He was not a fool. He was something more dangerous than a fool. He was a man with a doctrine. McNair believed with the certainty of a mathematician who has checked his proof 3 times that tanks should not fight other tanks. Tanks were for exploitation. Tanks were for racing into enemy rear areas, shooting up supply columns, spreading panic. When enemy armor appeared, it was to be handled by a separate force specially designed for the purpose. Fast, lightly armored vehicles called tank destroyers. They would ambush German panzers, fire 2 rounds, and vanish before the Germans could respond. On paper, the doctrine was elegant. In the hedgerows of Normandy, it was killing Americans. The Germans did not attack in the massed formations McNair had designed his tank destroyers to ambush. They defended in depth. They counterattacked with Panthers and Tigers that outranged every weapon McNair had provided. The tank destroyers, open-topped and thin-skinned, died when German armor caught them in the open. And when Ordnance Department officers proposed replacing the 76mm gun with a 90, McNair refused. The 76 was sufficient, he said. He had test data from Aberdeen Proving Ground to prove it. The tests showed the 76 penetrating Panther armor at adequate ranges. What the tests did not show, because the test plates did not behave the way real Panther plates behaved, was that German face-hardened armor caused American shells to shatter on impact. The data was wrong. The doctrine built on that data was wrong. McNair did not yet know this. He flew to Normandy on July 25th to watch Operation Cobra, the Great American Breakout. The bombing that opened the offensive used 1,500 heavy bombers. Some of them dropped short. A B-17 released its load 900 meters too early. Several aircraft followed. The bombs fell on American positions. One landed beside the slit trench where McNair had taken cover. The crater was more than 3 meters deep. They identified him by his 3 silver stars and his West Point-class ring.
Since
He was the highest-ranking American officer to die in combat in the Second World War. He was killed by his own Air Force, and in dying, he removed the single largest institutional obstacle to giving American tank crews the gun they needed to survive. The weapon that McNair had blocked was not new. Its origins had nothing to do with tanks. In the late 1930s, the Army had needed a replacement for its aging anti-aircraft gun. Aircraft were faster now, flying higher. The result was the 90mm M1 firing a 24-pound shell at 2,800 feet per second. It could reach targets at 34,000 feet of altitude. It had been designed from its first blueprint to look up, to kill bombers. But somewhere in the Ordnance Department in 1942, an engineer whose name has not survived in the records noticed something. The same velocity that drove a 90mm shell to 34,000 feet would, if the gun were aimed horizontally, drive that shell through almost any tank then in existence on the surface of the Earth. The 90mm anti-aircraft gun was, by an accident of physics, the most powerful anti-tank weapon in the American inventory. It had simply been pointed at the wrong target. The conversion project was given the designation T-71. The objective was to mount the 90mm on a chassis that could move and fight on the same ground as a tank. The chassis chosen was the M10A1, essentially a Sherman hull with a different turret. The new turret, the T-7, would be open-topped. The decision was deliberate. A closed turret would have added more than 2 tons of weight that the chassis could not absorb. The crew would be exposed to artillery airbursts and to enemy infantry. That was the price. The benefit was a weapon that could on paper penetrate the frontal armor of a Tiger at 2,000 yards. The first pilot vehicle was tested at Aberdeen Proving Ground in March 1944. Against sloped test plates, the 90mm punched through every armor plate placed in front of it. 5 inches, 6 inches, 7 inches. Each plate breached cleanly. An ordnance captain watching the test was heard to say one sentence, "This will end the Tigers." He was wrong about that in the literal sense, but he was right about something larger, something the Germans had not yet imagined. In April 1944, the Fisher Body Division of General Motors at the Grand Blanc Tank Arsenal in Michigan began series production. The new vehicle was designated the M36. By July, more than 100 had been built. By August, more than 300. Almost none of them were in Europe. McNair was in the ground at Normandy American Cemetery, but the bureaucracy that had grown around his doctrine was still very much alive. The M36 required training. It required ammunition stockpiles. It required logistical planning. The Army moved with the patience of an institution that had not yet been embarrassed enough to hurry. Meanwhile, in the forests of the German frontier, American crews continued to die. The first M36S reached the European theater in the last week of September 1944. They came off cargo ships at Cherbourg and Antwerp and were distributed in small numbers to existing tank destroyer battalions. The crews who received them noticed something immediately. The M36 looked almost identical to the old M10. Same hull, same tracks, same canvas weather cover over the open turret that never quite kept out the rain. Only the gun was different. Longer, slightly thicker. A millimeter difference that meant the difference between a shell that bounced and a shell that killed. Why? The memoranda that accompanied those deliveries all carried the same instruction. Engage enemy heavy armor at maximum effective range. Do not let the Germans understand what they are facing. In simpler words, they do not know what is coming. Keep it that way. The men who climbed into those vehicles in October 1944 were not heroes in any cinematic sense. They were mechanics and farmers and factory workers in their 20s who had been trained to operate a machine and sent to a place they had never expected to go. Some had been pulling M10 crews out of burning wrecks since the beaches. Others were brand new replacements who had never sat in a tracked vehicle. They were shown the M36. An instructor pointed at the gun. 90mm. A few of them laughed. They had been told for 4 months that their guns could not kill what was hunting them. The idea that this had changed seemed on first hearing like another rumor. The training was brief. A few rounds fired at salvaged German hulks, a few practiced traverses, a briefing on the new ammunition, then back to the line. The first real test came in the 3rd week of October. Somewhere in the rolling farmland east of the German border, a platoon of M36 sat hull down behind a stone wall built 2 centuries earlier by a Belgian farmer who could not have imagined what it would one day shelter. Through his telescope, the platoon leader found the lead Panther in his sight. The range was just over 2,000 yards. In any other American vehicle in his inventory, that range was meaningless. A 76mm round at 2,000 yards against Panther frontal armor would not have made the crew inside flinch. He looked at the new gun. He gave the order, decisive. The 90mm round crossed 2,000 yards in just over 3 seconds. It struck the Panther's turret front. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then the turret hatch blew off its hinges. A tongue of flame 30 feet long shot upward from inside the tank. The vehicle stopped. Black smoke climbed in a straight column into the gray October sky. The platoon leader picked up his radio handset. He held it for a long moment without speaking. He had just killed a Panther at 2,000 yards. Nobody in his battalion, in his regiment, in his division had ever done that before. Lies. The surviving Panthers reported the loss up the chain of command. Their commander wrote his after-action report. He needed to explain the cause of the loss. He wrote the phrase that would define the next 3 months of German intelligence failure: heavy artillery fire from unknown positions. He had not seen a tank destroyer. There was no muzzle flash visible at that range. There had been only the crack of an arriving shell at a distance no American gun was supposed to be able to reach. The German intelligence apparatus accepted the explanation without question. And so began a pattern that would repeat itself day after day for the next 10 weeks. German tanks dying at impossible ranges from a weapon that, according to every file in Berlin, did not exist. The secret was holding. But outside Bastogne, in the Ardennes forest, 68 tons of German steel were already moving into their starting positions. And when those King Tigers rolled forward on the morning of December 16th, they would be walking into something nobody had warned them about. The gun designed to shoot down B-17S was waiting for them. And in Part 2, you will see what happens when 6 King Tigers meet a handful of M36 on a road they cannot afford to lose, and why the battle that followed changed the entire course of the war in a single frozen morning. In October 1944, a weapon the Germans had never seen killed a Panther at 2,000 yards. The crew inside never knew what hit them. The platoon leader holding his radio handset couldn't find words. Nobody in the American Army had ever done that before. The M36 Jackson had arrived in Europe, quietly, carefully, with orders to stay hidden. But hidden weapons don't stay hidden forever. And in December 1944, the largest German offensive since D-Day was about to roll straight into the secret. 400,000 men, nearly 700 tanks, and intelligence reports telling every single German commander the same thing: American mobile anti-tank guns top out at 76 millimeters. They were about to find out how wrong that was. Here is what that cost them. By mid-December, the M36 had been operational for less than 8 weeks. Fewer than 200 had reached frontline units. Most tank destroyer battalions were still running the old M10 Wolverine. The crews who had the new gun were scattered, undertrained, and spread across an 85-mile front that nobody in Allied command believed the Germans would attack through. The Ardennes was considered a quiet sector. Rest and recovery. The 106th Infantry Division, fresh from the United States, was still learning what a German soldier looked like. The 28th had just been ground to pieces in the Hurtgen forest and sent here to heal. And on the morning of December 16th, 2,000 German guns fired simultaneously, and the quiet sector became the most dangerous 20 miles of ground in the world. Among the units holding the northern shoulder of what would become the Bulge was the 7th Armored Division, ordered down from a rest area to the road junction town of St. Vith. 5 roads converged there. Without St. Vith, the entire German timetable collapsed. The 6th Panzer Army needed those roads to reach the Meuse River. They needed them within 48 hours. Attached to the 7th Armored was the 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion. Some of its vehicles were M10s, some were the new M36. The crews had owned their new guns for 6 weeks. Some had fired fewer than 20 live rounds through them. On the morning of December 18th, those crews found themselves looking through their telescopes at targets no American gunner had ever been asked to engage. Tiger IIs. 68 tons, 150 millimeters of frontal steel. Moving through fog toward a town that could not be allowed to fall. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Barry, gathered his platoon leaders in a farmhouse outside town. The walls shook from artillery. A candle on the table threw orange light across faces that had not slept in 30 hours. "Those are King Tigers," he said. He did not need to explain what that meant. Every man in the room understood. Our job is to slow them down, not stop them, slow them. He looked at the men with M36. You have something they don't know about. Use the range. Make them stop and look for you. Every minute they spend looking is a minute St. Vith doesn't fall. One platoon leader, a 24-year-old from Ohio, whose name the records preserve only as Lieutenant Harmon, asked the question everyone was thinking. What if the 90 doesn't go through at 2,000? Barry looked at him. Then get closer. That was the entire briefing. What followed over the next 6 days was not a battle in any cinematic sense. It was a grinding, methodical contest of patience and positioning played out in fog so thick that visibility sometimes dropped to 200 yards. The M36 crews did exactly what tank destroyer doctrine had always promised and never quite delivered. They found their ground. They went hull down. They waited. When a King Tiger appeared through the fog at 1,500 yards, they fired. The 90mm round at that range could not reliably penetrate the Tiger II's frontal glacis. The armor math was brutal and real. 150mm of sloped steel against a round generating roughly 108mm of penetration at that distance. But here is what the numbers don't capture. A 90mm round arriving at 1,500 yards hits with a force that no crew inside any tank can ignore. It rings the hull like a bell. It strips external equipment. It cracks welds. It kills vision ports. And it tells the commander inside that something out there has a gun that can reach him at ranges he was told were safe. The Tiger II stopped. The column behind it stopped. The commander opened his hatch, looked into the fog, and saw nothing. No muzzle flash, no smoke trail, nothing but gray Belgian winter. By the time the German column had deployed into a combat formation to engage the threat, the M36 that fired was already 300 yards down the ridge, repositioning behind a stone wall, loading the next round. Fire, displace, disappear. Fire again from a different direction, and the Germans began attributing their losses to heavy artillery on flat trajectories, to improved American ammunition, to anything except the weapon actually killing them. And that confusion, that 30-minute delay, while a German panzer column stopped and reorganized after each engagement, compounded across 6 days into something extraordinary. St. Vith was supposed to hold for 48 hours. It held for 6 days. The 814th M36 crews fired from positions they abandoned before the return fire landed. They lost vehicles. Several were destroyed by German artillery once a position was identified. 2 were knocked out by infantry anti-tank teams who crept through the fog on foot. The open turret that had always been the tank destroyer's greatest vulnerability claimed American lives in frozen Belgian fields. But the Tiger IIs that were supposed to be rolling toward the Meuse by December 18th were still fighting for a road junction on December 22nd. The timetable had collapsed. The fuel calculations that the entire German offensive depended on were already failing. Piper's column to the north, driving hard for the river, was burning through reserves faster than the planners had projected. And then 40 miles to the north, something happened that would write the most dramatic chapter of the M36's war. Kampfgruppe Piper had been built around one concept: speed. Joachim Piper, 29 years old, Eastern Front veteran, SS Obersturmbannführer, had been given Panthers half-tracks infantry and a company of King Tigers from Heavy SS Tank Battalion 501. His orders were simple: race west, cross the Meuse, drive toward Antwerp, don't stop for anything. He almost made it. By December 21st, his column was strung across miles of narrow Belgian roads. The fuel depots he was supposed to capture had been burned or evacuated ahead of him. The bridges his King Tigers needed had collapsed under 68 tons of German engineering confidence. His infantry was exhausted. His Panthers were low on fuel, and American units were closing from 3 directions. The village of L'Église became Piper's last position. He concentrated everything he had left there: 42 armored vehicles, including most of his surviving King Tigers. American artillery found the village. P-47 Thunderbolts, finally flying again after days of fog, came down in waves on December 24th. Rockets, bombs, strafing runs that left lines of brass shell casings glittering in the snow. And from the tree line to the south, M36s of the 740th Tank Destroyer Battalion fired into the village at ranges between 800 and 1,200 yards. At those distances, the 90mm round was lethal. Against the side armor of a King Tiger, it was decisive. The German armor in L'Église could not maneuver. Piper's vehicles were boxed in by narrow streets, by bomb craters, by the bodies of vehicles already destroyed. One after another, the King Tigers burned. On the night of December 24th, Piper made his decision. He ordered 800 surviving men to abandon every vehicle and break out on foot through the woods to the east. They left 39 armored vehicles behind, not knocked out, not destroyed, simply out of fuel and out of options. Among the abandoned vehicles were the last King Tigers of Heavy SS Tank Battalion 501. The crews of those M36 who had been firing into L'Église did not know in the moment what they had done. They knew they had killed German armor. They did not know they had essentially ended the most dangerous armored spearhead of the entire Ardennes offensive. Further south, on the night of December 24th, at the road junction of Manhay, another fight was deciding another piece of the battle. Elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, had pushed through the American lines and were driving toward Liège. The town fell. American infantry fell back. For several hours, the situation was genuinely dangerous. In the village of Grandmesnil, just beyond Manhay, a small force stopped. M36s of the 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion backed against buildings hull down in doorways, firing at ranges as close as 500 yards. The fight lasted through the night and into Christmas morning. Several M36 were destroyed by German Panzerschreck rockets fired from upper windows. 2 were hit by Panthers that had gotten within 300 yards under cover of darkness. But the Panthers that tried to move through Grandmesnil died. The after-action report written by the German commander that morning contained a sentence that would shape the next phase of German intelligence failure. It read, "American tank destroyer fire of unusually high penetration, possibly employing British tungsten core ammunition." It was an elegant explanation. The British had been fielding tungsten-cored rounds for their 17-pounder anti-tank guns since spring. German intelligence knew about them. When their tanks started dying at impossible ranges in October and November, the analysts had reached for the explanation they already had. The Americans must be using British ammunition, same gun, different shell. That explained everything without requiring anyone to admit that German intelligence had completely missed an entirely new American weapon. The explanation was wrong. The gun killing them was not a 76 firing a special round. It was a 90. It had been a 90 for 3 months. And every week the Germans spent believing the wrong explanation was another week their tank commanders planned their tactics around a weapon that did not exist, while the real weapon kept reaching across hedgerows and ridgelines and killing them. By the last days of December, the German offensive was dying. Not from any single defeat. From everything at once. The fuel that ran out. The bridges that collapsed. The weather that finally cleared on December 23rd and brought American air power down like a hammer. The American reinforcements that arrived from every direction, Patton's Third Army driving north to Bastogne, the 82nd Airborne, holding the northern shoulder. And through all of it, the M36s. Firing from positions the Germans couldn't see. With a gun the Germans didn't know existed. At ranges the Germans had been told were safe. Somewhere in a headquarters bunker in early January 1945, a German intelligence officer finally read a report he should have read in October. An engineer team had measured a knocked-out M36 3 months earlier. The report had traveled by truck, then rail, then truck again. It had sat in a waiting room in Berlin during an air raid. It had been forwarded, lost, and forwarded again. The data in it was unambiguous. The American M36 tank destroyer carried a 90mm gun. A bulletin went out immediately to all panzer formations. Effective immediately, all American tank destroyers were to be presumed armed with 90mm weapons. Engagement ranges were to be adjusted. Frontal exposure was to be avoided. The bulletin reached frontline commanders in the second week of January 1945. By that point, the Wehrmacht had already lost most of its remaining offensive power in the West. The tanks the bulletin was meant to protect were either burning in the Ardennes or retreating toward the Rhine. The information was 3 months late. And now the Americans were moving east. The Rhine was ahead. Germany itself was ahead. And the M36 battalions, no longer secret, no longer hiding what they carried, were rolling forward with the rest. But ahead of them lay something their crews had not yet been tested against. Not Tiger IIs in defensive positions. Not Panthers in hedgerows. A river crossing under fire with the weight of 60,000 pounds of American steel resting on a bridge that German engineers were desperately trying to destroy. And in Part 3, you will see what happened at Remagen and why the gun designed to shoot down bombers helped crack open the door to Germany itself. The M36 had done what nothing else in the American inventory could do. It had killed Panthers at 2,000 yards. It had stopped King Tigers at St. Vith. It had burned Piper's armored spearhead in the streets of L'Église. And in early January 1945, a German intelligence bulletin finally confirmed what 3 months of burning tanks should have told them much earlier. The Americans had a 90mm gun. The bulletin was too late to save the Ardennes offensive, but it was not too late to change how the Germans would fight the final campaign. Because now they knew. And an enemy that knows what is killing them is a different enemy entirely. In the first 2 weeks of January 1945, German panzer commanders up and down the Western Front received new orders. Maintain standoff distance from American tank destroyer positions. Avoid frontal exposure beyond 2,000 meters. Coordinate all armored advances with artillery suppression. The tactical language was dry and professional. The meaning underneath it was not. The Germans were telling their tank crews that the weapon they had been told was safe was not safe. That the ranges they had been told were unreachable could be reached. That every assumption baked into 6 months of combat doctrine was now wrong. Scheid, a tiger. II commander reading that bulletin in January 1945 faced a problem with no clean solution. His tank weighed 68 tons. It consumed fuel at a rate that had already crippled one entire offensive. It was too heavy for many Belgian bridges. It could not maneuver quickly. And now the weapon that had always been its justification, the ability to engage American armor from ranges where American guns were helpless, had been cancelled. The M36 could reach him. Not always. Not from every angle, but enough. Enough to make every advance a calculation of exposure and probability that had not existed 4 months earlier. German after-action reports from January and February 1945 showed the change in their language. Where autumn reports had described confident advances disrupted by mysterious losses, the winter reports described hesitation, columns that stopped at ridgelines and waited for artillery before advancing, commanders who requested air reconnaissance before committing armor to roads where American tank destroyers might be waiting. The M36 had not just killed German tanks. It had altered how German commanders thought about every piece of ground between their position and the American line. The total German armored losses on the Western Front in January 1945 were the highest of any single month since D-Day. The specific contribution of M36 kills within that total is impossible to isolate with precision. Battlefield accounting in the winter of 1944 was imperfect and often contradictory. But the pattern in the German reports is consistent. Units that encountered M36 disengaged faster, took heavier losses in the initial exchange, and required more time to reorganize than units fighting against M10s or Shermans. Bam! The gun was working, but the gun was also exposing something the Ordnance Department had not fully anticipated. The M36 that the crews were actually fighting in was not the M36 that existed on paper. Production pressure had introduced variations. Some vehicles had ammunition stowage that made loading the 90mm rounds under fire slower than the specifications promised. Some turret traverse mechanisms were stiff in temperatures below freezing, and Belgium in January 1945 was very much below freezing. Several crews reported that the T-30E-16 tungsten cored round, the ammunition that could actually penetrate Tiger II frontal armor at reasonable ranges, was arriving in quantities far below what the combat situation required. Battalions were allocated 40 rounds per vehicle. The tungsten rounds sometimes numbered 4 or 5 per vehicle, sometimes none. A tank destroyer with a 90mm gun and no tungsten ammunition facing a King Tiger's frontal plate was a tank destroyer that had to get closer than its doctrine intended or wait for a flank shot that might not come. The gap between the weapon's theoretical performance and its practical performance in the field was real, and the men fighting inside the open turrets knew it in a way that the ordnance officers in Cherbourg did not. The internal argument about tungsten allocation ran through February 1945 at the battalion and regimental level, generating memoranda that moved slowly up chains of command, already overwhelmed by the pace of the Allied advance. The argument was never fully resolved. The war ended before it was. But it was not the tungsten shortage that defined the M36's final chapter. What defined it was a bridge. March 7, 1945, 1500 hours. The western bank of the Rhine River, just south of the town of Remagen. A forward patrol from the 9th Armored Division crested a hill and saw something that should not have been there. The Ludendorff Bridge, a double-tracked railway span crossing the Rhine, was still standing. German engineers had placed demolition charges. The charges had fired. The bridge was damaged. It was not destroyed. The patrol commander had perhaps 4 minutes to make a decision that would shape the final weeks of the war in Europe. He ordered the advance. American infantry crossed at a run under fire, cutting demolition wires as they went. Engineers followed. A toehold was established on the eastern bank. German soil, the last major geographic barrier in the West, had been crossed. The bridge had a weight limit. The question now was, what could cross it before German engineers found a way to finish the job? Infantry could cross immediately. Wheeled vehicles could cross. Tanks at 60,000 pounds apiece were a different calculation. The 656th Tank Destroyer Battalion was among the first armored units ordered to the bridge. Its M36s weighed considerably less than a Sherman tank. The decision was made to send them across. The first M36 moved onto the bridge at approximately 16:30 on March 7th. The crew inside could hear the structure shifting beneath them. The wooden planks laid over the railway ties by engineers flexed under the tracks. The driver held the vehicle to walking speed. The gunner kept his hands off the controls, not wanting to add any vibration to a structure that was groaning audibly. And 300 meters of bridge. 300 meters of steel, damaged by explosives and by German artillery already beginning to range in from the eastern bank. The first vehicle crossed, then the second, then the third. German 88mm guns on the eastern heights opened fire. Shells struck the bridge structure, throwing steel fragments across the deck. One vehicle was hit by shrapnel and stopped briefly before the driver found the engine still running and pushed forward. An M36 with a damaged track slewed sideways on the bridge deck and had to be pushed by the vehicle behind it, a moment of absolute grinding terror for both crews while German shells continued arriving. All three vehicles made it across. On the eastern bank, in the shadow of a rail cutting that provided partial cover, the M36 crews set up to hold the bridgehead against the German counterattack that everyone knew was coming. It came within the hour. German infantry Volkssturm reservists, mixed with remnants of regular army units, came down the eastern slopes toward the bridgehead perimeter. German artillery intensified. Two of the M36s moved to hull down positions covering the main approach roads from the east. The third covered the bridge itself against the possibility of German armor reaching the crossing point. But German armor did not reach the crossing point. Not that day. Not because it was not attempted, but because the road network east of Remagen was already congested with retreating German columns, and the units close enough to respond quickly were not the heavy panzer formations, but second-line infantry with anti-tank guns that the 90mm could engage before they came into range of the bridgehead. By midnight on March 7th, 8,000 American soldiers were on the eastern bank of the Rhine. By the morning of March 8th, engineers had begun constructing pontoon bridges upstream and downstream from the Ludendorff span. The crossing was no longer dependent on a single damaged bridge. The Ludendorff Bridge collapsed on March 17th, killing 28 American engineers who were working on it. By then, it did not matter. There were 4 crossing points operational along the Rhine. American armor was flowing east in quantities the German army no longer had the resources to stop. The M36s of the 656th were among the first armored vehicles on German soil in the Western theater. The symbolic weight of that moment was not lost on the men who experienced it, though few of them wrote about it in language that captured the feeling. What most of them recorded was more practical. The roads were better. The ground was flatter. The tank destroyer built for the hedgerow fighting of Normandy and the forest fighting of the Hurtgen now had room to use its range in a way that the constricted terrain of Belgium and France had rarely permitted. An engagement east of the Rhine in late March, recorded in the 656th's after-action reports, described a situation that would have been impossible 4 months earlier. An M36 platoon, advancing along a road through open agricultural land, observed a column of Panzer IVs attempting to move parallel to the American advance, approximately 2,200 yards to the north. The platoon deployed into the fields. Firing from stationary positions across open ground, they destroyed 4 of the 7 Panzer IVs in the column before the German vehicles could reach cover. The surviving 3 turned south away from the American line of advance and were not seen again.
Defies.
4 kills at 2,200 yards in open daylight. Against Panther or Tiger, 2 frontal armor, those shots would have been marginal at best. Against Panzer IVs, they were decisive. The M36's gun, designed for the worst-case armored threat, was more than adequate against the vehicles that now constituted the majority of the German armored force still operating in the West. By March 1945, production of M36 in the United States had reached nearly 200 vehicles per month. More than 1,700 had been built in total. The battalions that had gone into the Ardennes with a handful of new guns were now fully equipped. The crews that had been uncertain about the weapon in October were now professionals. They knew its capabilities and its limits. They knew when to shoot and when to wait. The German army they were advancing against was hollowing out in real time. Divisions existed on paper that had no men to fill them. Artillery units fired their last ammunition and spiked their guns. Volkssturm battalions of 50-year-old men and 16-year-old boys held positions until they broke, then surrendered in groups of dozens, hundreds, eventually thousands. The M36 was no longer a secret. It was no longer a surprise. It was simply a weapon present in the inventory, like the Sherman and the M10, before it operated by men who had been doing this work for the better part of a year, and who wanted with a clarity that required no philosophical language to finish it and go home. What had started as a converted anti-aircraft gun in a Detroit factory, delayed by doctrine and bureaucracy, and the death of the man who embodied both, had become in 8 months of combat one of the defining anti-armor weapons of the Western campaign. But what happened to the weapon after the war ended? And what happened to the men who crewed it? What does it mean that the last operational M36 in the world was retired? Not in 1945, not in 1955, but in 1993 on an island in the Taiwan Strait, by a soldier who had never heard of the Battle of the Bulge. That story, the story of what a weapon leaves behind, is the one chapter that history almost never tells. And it is the one that changes everything you think you know about who actually won this war. From a converted anti-aircraft gun that nobody wanted near a tank to the weapon that stopped the last great German offensive in the West. From motor pools in Michigan to burning fields in Belgium. From a doctrine built on wrong test data, freed only by the death of the man who believed it to 2,000 yards of open ground, and a panther that never saw what killed it. That is the journey of the M36 Jackson across 4 parts of this story. But there is one question that none of the combat footage, none of the after-action reports, none of the ordnance tables can answer. What happened to the men who crewed it when the guns finally went quiet? And there is one detail about this weapon that almost no history book includes. A detail that reframes everything you have just heard. Because the M36 did not end in 1945. It did not end in Korea. It did not end in the 1960s or the 1970s. The last M36 Jackson in operational military service was retired in 1993, 48 years after the war that built it. That is the part of the story most people never reach. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the men of the tank destroyer battalions came home the way most American soldiers came home. Quietly. By ship. In groups of hundreds, processed through separation centers, where clerks typed their discharge papers and handed them manila envelopes containing their service records and whatever back pay the Army calculated they were owed. There were no parades specifically for the tank destroyer arm. The tank destroyers had always been the awkward branch born from a doctrine that never quite worked. Equipped first with weapons that were not good enough, then with weapons that arrived almost too late. They had done their job with the tools they were given, and when the job was done, the Army ground forces that McNair had built began to dismantle itself as quickly as it had been assembled. The 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion, which had bought 6 impossible days at St. Vith with its M36, was inactivated in July 1945. The 703rd, which had held Grand Menil on Christmas morning, was inactivated in September. The 656th, which had crossed the Ludendorff Bridge with its guns pointing east into Germany, was gone by the end of the year. The unit designation survived in Army records. The men scattered back to Ohio and Texas and Pennsylvania and Iowa, to the farms and the factories and the small businesses that had been waiting for them. Most of them did not talk about what they had done, not because it was classified, but because the people asking the questions did not have the framework to understand the answers. You cannot explain to someone who has never sat in an open turret in a Belgian December what it feels like to fire a gun at a target 2,000 yards away and wait 3 seconds to see whether you have killed something or whether the thing you were shooting at is now going to kill you. The gap between the experience and the language available to describe it was simply too wide. One veteran of the 814th, interviewed decades later by a historian at the Army's Center for Military History, was asked what he remembered most about the M36. He thought for a long moment. Then he said the smell of the brass case when it hit the catcher, hot metal and burnt propellant. Every time I smell something like that, now I am back in Belgium. That is the whole of the human record for most of these men. A smell, a sound, a detail that the history books cannot hold. The officers who commanded the tank destroyer battalions fared slightly better in terms of institutional recognition. Several received decorations for their unit's performance in the Ardennes. The Army's post-war analysis, the European Theater of Operations General Board Report No. 60, specifically cited tank destroyer performance at St. Vith and Bastogne as contributing factors in the failure of the German offensive. That citation exists in the records. The men who earned it mostly never read it. Leslie McNair, the man whose doctrine had delayed the M36 and whose death had freed it, received a posthumous 4th star. He is buried at Normandy American Cemetery where he died. His legacy is complicated in the way that all legacies built on confident wrong assumptions tend to be complicated. He was not a villain. He was a man who built a system on data that turned out to be incorrect, and who died before the system's failure was fully visible. The Army has a training facility named for him. The irony is quiet and persistent. The M36 itself outlived almost everyone involved in its creation. After the war, the United States transferred large numbers of M36 to Allied nations under the Military Assistance Program. France received them. Yugoslavia received them. South Korea received a substantial allocation in the early 1950s, just in time for a war that nobody had planned for, and everybody was suddenly fighting. In Korea, the M36 encountered the Soviet T-34/85, the tank that had ground the Wehrmacht down on the Eastern Front. Against the T-34/85, the 90mm gun was more than adequate. It was, by the standards of 1950, an overmatch. The same weapon that had struggled at extreme ranges against Tiger, 2 frontal armor, handled the T-34/85 with a margin to spare. Korean War after-action reports from the units operating M36 describe engagements that lack the grinding tension of the Belgian hedgerows. The gun was simply better than what it was shooting at. This mattered less than it should have because by the time the Korean War started, the open-topped tank destroyer concept had already been declared obsolete by the United States Army. The tank destroyer branch itself had been abolished in 1946, its functions absorbed by the armor branch. The doctrine that McNair had built, and that Belgium had broken, was officially retired. The future belonged to the main battle tank, a single vehicle that could both exploit breakthroughs and kill enemy armor without relying on a separate doctrine and a separate organizational structure. The M36s that went to Allied nations continued their service on that premise, not as representatives of a doctrine, but simply as useful guns on useful chassis that happened to still work. Yugoslavia kept them operational into the 1960s. And then something unexpected happened. The Yugoslav army, which had received its M36 from the United States in the late 1940s, found that the vehicles were robust enough to be worth upgrading rather than replacing. They fitted some with improved engines. They modified the ammunition stowage. They kept them running with the kind of practical ingenuity that armies develop when their equipment budgets are limited and their vehicles are reliable. South Korea took a similar approach. The M36s in South Korean service were maintained modified and kept operational through the 1960s and into the 1970s. By that point, they were genuinely obsolete against modern Soviet armor, but the Korean peninsula is terrain that rewards certain kinds of weapons, and a 90mm gun in a prepared defensive position covering a road through mountainous ground remained tactically relevant long past the point where anyone in Detroit would have predicted. Taiwan took the logic furthest. The Republic of China, Army on Taiwan, received M36s through the Military Assistance Program in the 1950s. They kept them. They maintained them. They upgraded what could be upgraded and kept the rest original. And they continued operating them in training and in the standing defensive posture that the Taiwan Strait required through the 1970s, through the 1980s, and into the early 1990s. The last operational M36 in any military service anywhere in the world was retired by the Republic of China Army around 1993. A weapon designed in 1942, built in Michigan, first fired in anger in Belgium in October 1944, ended its working life on a training ground in Taiwan nearly 50 years later. The young soldier who climbed down from that turret for the last time in 1993 was probably born around 1973. He had no connection to the Second World War except the machine beneath his feet. He did not know that the gun above his head had been designed to shoot down bombers. He did not know that its first combat kill had been a Panther at 2,000 yards in an October fog. He did not know the names of the battalions that had used it at St. Vith or L'Église or Remagen. To him, it was an old machine that needed constant maintenance and smelled of old grease and older metal. He walked away from it, and the Army of the Republic of China put it in a warehouse, and that was the end. The bravest thing about that fact is how ordinary it is. Weapons do not retire with ceremony. They are not thanked for their service. The M36 Jackson, which by conservative post-war estimates destroyed approximately 350 German armored vehicles, including perhaps 40 Tiger IIs, out of fewer than 500 ever built, ended its working life not with a salute, but with a work order and a locked door. What does any of this mean? The question is worth asking precisely because the answer is not simple. The M36 is sometimes held up as proof that American industrial power won the Second World War. And the industrial numbers are real, and they are staggering. The United States built 2,300 M36, while Germany built 490 Tiger IIs. That ratio, applied across every category of equipment in the war, explains a great deal about why the Allies won and the Axis lost. You cannot sustain an offensive when your enemy replaces his losses faster than you can create them. But the M36's story is also proof that industrial power without the right weapon produces the wrong result. 300 Shermans cannot substitute for one M36 if what you need is a gun that can reach across 2,000 yards and kill what is killing you. Quantity matters. But the right tool at the right moment matters differently in a way that numbers alone cannot capture. B. The deeper lesson is about the cost of certainty. McNair was not wrong because he was stupid. He was wrong because he was certain. He had data. He had doctrine. He had a logical system built on logical foundations, and the foundations turned out to be false because the test plates at Aberdeen did not behave the way real German armor behaved, and nobody found out until American crews were dying in Normandy. Certainty is expensive. The cost of McNair's certainty was paid in burning Shermans and dead young men in Norman fields in the summer of 1944. The men who built the M36 in the face of that certainty, who kept the program alive through McNair's objections, who figured out how to mount a 90mm anti-aircraft gun on a tank destroyer chassis and make it work in Belgian mud and German snow, were not geniuses in any romantic sense. They were engineers and ordnance officers doing difficult technical work under institutional pressure, and they were right when the institution was wrong. That is the whole of their heroism. Being right when the institution is wrong and continuing to work despite that is not a small thing. It is in most fields and in most eras the hardest thing. No. Here is the detail that almost no one includes. The 90mm gun that went into the M36 was not derived from the anti-aircraft gun after careful planning. The connection was noticed almost by accident by an engineer whose name has not survived in any record that historians have found. He looked at a ballistics table for an anti-aircraft weapon and recognized that the same numbers that described a shell rising to 34,000 feet also described a shell that would go through any tank then in existence. He pointed this out. Someone listened. The program began. The weapon that stopped the King Tigers at St. Vith, that burned Piper's armored column in L'Église, that crossed the Rhine at Remagen, and rolled east into Germany, that served in Korea and Algeria, and on the hills of Taiwan for half a century, began with one anonymous man looking at a table of numbers and seeing something that had been there all along, pointing in the wrong direction. From a Belgian field in October 1944 to a training ground in Taiwan in 1993. From a converted anti-aircraft gun that nobody wanted near a tank to 350 destroyed German armored vehicles to 48 years of service across a dozen nations. The M36 Jackson proved that the right idea delayed and doubted and nearly buried by the system, meant to deploy it, will eventually find the moment it was built for. And the unnamed engineer who first saw it, who looked at a number on a page and understood what it meant, never knew any of that. He never knew about St. Vith. He never knew about L'Église. He never knew about the bridge at Remagen or the training ground in Taiwan. He did his work, and the work outlasted him by 50 years, and the war was shorter for it, and some number of men came home because of it. And that is what it looks like when the right idea finally gets pointed in the right direction. That is worth remembering, because the next right idea is out there right now in someone's notebook or someone's ballistics table, waiting for the person who will look at it and see what it actually is. If you found this story worth 90 minutes of your time, leave a comment below with a weapon or invention from history you think deserves its own series. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story we tell. There are hundreds of them. Most of them are about ordinary people who looked at ordinary problems and found extraordinary answers. The gun that looked up at the sky and then looked back at the earth changed the course of a war. The man who first pointed it in the right direction never knew his name would not survive. But the work did. The work always does.